All a man needs do is fight and die. That is the way in the Death Korps of Krieg. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going to be doing a bit of an overview of the Death Korps of Krieg, including a little bit of background, how their army is constructed and functions, and what units they have access to in games of 40k. I know the Death Korps are a really popular army, as I've seen a decent number of people who collect them, and for the sheer amount of money that Forge World makes you pay for each fancy resin miniature, people must like them a whole lot. These grim and determined gas mask equipped guardsmen really seem to have a big World War I vibe going on, with lines of determined infantry advancing or holding the line, heavy artillery pounding the enemy from above, and even their disturbing gas mask equipped horses in the Death Riders, well, sort of horses anyway. In the background, the Death Korps originates from of course the world of Krieg, which is a devastated post-nuclear death world where a rebellion against the Emperor took over 500 years to be put down. The citizens of Krieg were forced to retreat underground to sheltered hive cities to save themselves from the toxic environment. The Death Korps see themselves as constantly in repentance for these crimes, doing their duty to fight and die on the front lines of the Imperium of Man. Once the Kriegsmen were able to raise regiments once more, their first initial confrontations were in the Siege of Rax, a brutal and costly campaign to retake the planet from the renegades and heretics that had usurped it. They were a very cool regiment with some decent background and some beautiful miniatures, so let's see what they do on the table these days. So when 8th edition came about and the rules for the Imperial Guard, at least Forge World wise, were all folded into one index, the Death Korps received some extra benefits and advantages over their standard Astra Militarum cousins, but paid one additional point per model on their basic infantry. Normal Death Korps infantrymen are still 5 points as opposed to the regular guardsmen who have 4, despite the fact that they get regimental doctrines as well on top of this. Basically now Kriegsmen pay 1 point more and give up their choice of regimental doctrine for these 3 advantages. Firstly, they have Cult of Sacrifice, which is a morale boosting special rule. Basically, they just ignore any casualties caused in the shooting phase in terms of morale casualties. Now this is actually a really decent little rule in terms of making your guard army more durable. If you are running a fair few infantry squads, it generally is fairly easy for a gunline opponent to make morale casualties work against you, by say killing 6 or 7 guardsmen in a squad and letting morale take care of a bunch of the rest. Being able to know that that's just never going to be a factor for Kriegsmen, and they're only ever going to get scared and run away when they are actually in close combat, is really quite a nice advantage. In addition to that, they also get weapon skill 3+ on their standard infantry, so you're going to be getting a fair few more strength 3 hits in the fight phase as well. And they also come equipped with crack grenades as standards, which can give them just a little bit more anti-heavies punch when they're up close and personal with enemy heavy infantry or vehicles. It's interesting and perhaps a little bit unhelpful that their special rules work in 2 different areas of the game. Cult of Sacrifice only helps you against shooting casualties, where their weapon skill 3+ only ever helps you in melee, meaning that they certainly aren't dedicated melee guardsmen, and if they're just shooting they're wasting any weapon skill advantages. Out of the 2, I think that Cult of Sacrifice is by far the stronger rule. No casualties from shooting is a decent advantage to a guard gunline, as guards are generally stronger at shooting. I'd say that the weapon skill 3+ is something that's nice to have if you do happen to get into close combat, and certain units certainly can make use of it, like the Death Riders, but it's not really usually going to be the make or break factor between whether you charge into close combat or not, as you're only going to be getting a few more smattering of strength 3 hits, which don't really tend to get you a very long way in 8th edition these days. Now I think that these advantages would be pretty decent if they were combined together and they were just another regimental doctrine that your guardsmen could get. However, paying that extra point for it really does make it a bit more painful, and as you're giving up the choice of a different regiment option to take these advantages, they don't compare particularly favourably with say just standard 4-point Cadian or Castan guardsmen. It's also quite disappointing that their vehicles don't get any bonus for being Death Korps of Krieg. All of the other standard regiments in the Astra Militarum Codex do. At least they get something to help them out, whereas the Krieg ones are just very much their base stats, as they don't get either weapon skill 3+, and Cult of Sacrifice doesn't affect them. This means that in any sort of competitive list, unless you're absolutely determined for every single unit to have the Death Korps tag, then it's generally more competitive to run your Death Korps infantry in one detachment, and basically put any of your vehicles in another detachment, where you could take advantage of a different regimental trait, or you could use, say, a custom regiment, like the jury-rigged repairs and +6-inch ranged heavy weapons version, so your tanks get a nice upgrade, while your infantry all remain Death Korps. The Death Korps infantry swap out some orders. They lose first rank fire and take aim, but gain duty unto death and without mercy. The loss of first rank fire, second rank fire is really quite a big blow to the infantry squads. Being able to blaze away with 4 lasgun shots at close range is really handy, but they still get the same strength benefit at longer range, as without mercy the order will allow them to change it to pistol 2 for any lasguns or hotshot lasguns, so you'll still get your 2 shots at 24-inch range. On top of that can give you some options for shooting into close combat if you don't want to leave combat, so it could help out occasionally in protracted combats, and will typically be stronger than using fixed bayonets to fight again in the shooting phase, provided you've got a decent number of lasguns in the squad, that is. They also unfortunately lose take aim, which is the one which allows you to reroll hit rolls of 1, and this is really quite a downside for plasma weapons in the Krieg list, as you lose one very easy way of not blowing yourself up. In terms of damage output, you can just use Bring It Down still for reroll wound rolls of 1, which statistically is the same in damage output, but it doesn't help out those plasma weapons and things. Finally, they also gain Duty Unto Death, and this allows any infantry or cavalry model in the unit that's killed in the fight phase to immediately make a single attack. It's not too bad, maybe could be useful on Death Riders if you ordered them in the shooting phase, and then they know they're going to charge a target that's likely to kill at least some of them, then you might get a few extra attacks that way. For protracted combats though, it might just be better to use Without Mercy to fire your las weapons as pistol weapons in the shooting phase, and get that extra damage even before you get killed. So a little bit situational for me, only really all that good for charging targets that you don't think you're just going to wipe out straight away, and are going to kill you back at least somewhat. They have some slight variances in their heavy and special weapons, as well as their normal heavy weapon list. They also gain access to the Heavy Flamer and Twin Heavy Stubber as weapons that they can put onto their heavy weapon teams. Now, I'm still really not the biggest fan of flamer weapons in the Guard Codex. The vast majority of the time I much prefer to just have something that can just reliably do damage at longer range, like heavy bolters or autocannons or something, particularly as those options are far cheaper than heavy flamers. I guess it could be fun if you have them jumping out of a Chimera or a Valkyrie or something and want a little bit of extra close range firepower, but it really isn't all that much an efficient choice. The Twin Heavy Stubber is interesting, although unfortunately it does cost a lot more than the single Heavy Stubber. The Twin Heavy Stubber is 8 points, so costs the same as a Heavy Bolter, but gets you 6 Strength 4 AP nothing shots rather than 3 Strength 5 AP 1 shots. Against most infantry, unless there's something like Space Marines in cover, then the Twin Heavy Stubber will generally do you better, and the Heavy Bolter might do you a little bit better when targeting Toughness 8 vehicles and things. So in my mind this one does compete pretty decently, and can certainly have some good use. In terms of special weapons, you do lose access to the sniper rifle compared to your standard Astra Militarum, which isn't the biggest deal in the world but a little bit annoying. Compared with other regiments, you also lose access to any regimental warlord traits, relics or stratagems. Krieg still don't have their own, and they will remain not doing so until Games Workshop gets around to rewriting their rules, which they have said that they will do at some point in the future. Interestingly, in an FAQ they were allowed to be taken as Genestealer Cult Brood Brothers, and that might be interesting for some of their options, but they do lose Cult of Sacrifice to do this, so you certainly don't want to be taking the standard Death Korps of Krieg infantry as Brood Brothers, but some of the other options could be interesting. To round out the video, we've just got a quick slide on all of the options that Death Korps of Krieg can take at the moment. Basically in the Astra Militarum Index, it gives you a ton of actual unique Death Korps datasheets, which I've listed here below. I've put the HQs, troops, elites, fast attacks and heavy supports choices in order, and hopefully we'll be able to go through some of these datasheets at a later date. From the main Guard Codex though, they are pretty limited. They can only take the Master of Ordnance, Basilisk, Hydras, Tank Commanders or Hellhounds as actual Death Korps units. There are many omissions to this list, and the Death Korps aren't actually technically allowed to field things like Sentinels and Manticores as Death Korps. Interestingly though, if you did give them some sort of other regiment keyword, there's absolutely nothing to stop you including them in the exact same detachment as the rest of your Death Korps forces. The reason is that they all share the Astra Militarum keyword, so they're all able to be included within the same detachment, and the way that the Cult of Sacrifice rule works is that it just applies to every single Death Korps unit that you buy. It doesn't have to be a pure detachment of Death Korps, unlike the regimental doctrines that the standard Astra Militarum get. So you could have a battalion detachment with Death Korps troops and Death Korps HQs, and include a squadron of Sentinels or a Manticore, technically from another regiment, but they'd just be in the same detachment. The Sentinels and Manticore would get no extra special rules, not that they would have anyway if they'd been officially Death Korps, and they also wouldn't stop your Death Korps units gaining Cult of Sacrifice. However, if you actually do want them to have a few buffs on the tabletop, as we said before, it will be more competitive to include the vehicles in another detachment, technically from a different regiment, and give them one of the standard regiment buffs, or some of the very nice custom regiment buffs for vehicles that are found in the Greater Good. If you did take these options, they wouldn't technically be a pure Death Korps army from a rules perspective, but for the vast majority of people that's not going to be the biggest deal ever. I imagine that quite a lot of people will be quite surprised that Death Korps don't technically get access to Sentinels, if you mentioned it to them. Finally, the Death Korps also get access to all of these Forge World Guard options. Some of them are listed in the index themselves, the others were listed in the FAQ where they were added to this list, probably when Forge World realised that a lot of their own miniatures weren't actually being permitted in their own Death Korps army, which doesn't really make all that much sense to me either. Again though, none of these will actually gain any benefit from being Death Korps, unless they actually happen to be infantry, in which case they gain Cult of Sacrifice. So I hope that was a reasonable introduction to the Death Korps of Krieg. They've definitely been in a pretty funny place rules-wise since the start of 8th edition, and I think that all Death Korps players are pretty much looking forward to a rewrite under Games Workshop's new rules whenever they happen to come out. I'll be hoping to take a look at the standard Death Korps infantry squad and their Grenadier squad in the near future, and that one should be coming out within a week, and I'm sure we'll have more chance for reviews of some of these other units as we go onward throughout the year. If you'd like to see any more Death Korps content, of course feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you don't want to miss anything. And if you've been enjoying these videos, feel free to support me on my Patreon page, which helps to keep this channel going, so if you have been watching regularly, any support is much appreciated. In any case, a very big thank you for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.